You may not know it yet, but your life is about to change. I am so glad that you joined us this week. I have a great friend of mine I haven't seen in a long time. I want to catch up with him, but I want to introduce you to him as well and his wonderful ministry that I guarantee you is going to challenge your life and you will be changed. Here's my friend, Doron Keidar. Doron, how are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. Thank
Good
you.
to see you, brother.
Enjoying the beautiful weather here in Texas?
I guess you are.
Yeah.
Well, tell the people who you are, where you're from, and what in the world you're doing in Texas.
It's a good question. Well, my name is Doron Keidar, born and raised in Israel. Contrary to my accent, it sounds like folks are usually confused and they're wondering what state I'm from, where I grew up in the U.S. And I actually, like I said, I was born, raised, and grew up in Israel. Actually a Galilean. I grew up just along the border with Lebanon in a small town called Kiryat Shmona, which means City of Eight. And so this little town is where I grew up with a bunch of Moroccan kids. Those were my friends and the people I grew up with, and that was my upbringing. And it's funny because I had a pastor friend of mine from Roswell, New Mexico, who kind of poked fun of that because I totally forgot I even told him. He says, "Yeah, this guy. Have you guys ever seen Oshpizin?" And Oshpizin is
great movie.
Yeah, it's a film about.
In fact, I met the guy who was one of the main actors in Tel Aviv.
Oh, did you?
I saw him in a hotel and we yelled at him.
Yeah. The guy's just like.
He turns around.
Yeah.
It's like, I didn't know anybody still saw that movie. It's a great movie.
I know. In Israel,
it's about Sukkot.
That's right. In Israel, it's not a very popular movie, actually. But I've noticed there are people all over the world watching the film, and so they know it, especially, Christians that are coming back to a Jewish understanding of their faith. And so to them, that's kind of like a little point of contact of here's how the Jewish people do it, which is true because that's something that's really neat about the film is that it is halachically true. That was one of Shuli Ran's, missions when we filmed this. Let it be authentic. Let it be real. Let the people feel real. Let and also, of course, him being an Orthodox Jew, he was consulting his rabbis throughout and also wanting to what we call Kiddush Hashem, the honor of the name of God, or honoring him in the making of the film and not bringing any dishonor through this production. And so that was a big concern for these religious guys. Of course, the ones who actually play the secular guys, they are also in real life secular. And and so, to them, I don't think it was such a big issue as it was really for the religious crowd that you saw there. And they're all real people. That's the other funny thing, is that they weren't actors. They never acted before. And just the way they put that whole thing together was a neat project. But at any rate, so from this film, Oshpizin, that now many people are aware of around the world, and if you haven't seen it, go to Google it, and how do you pronounce or write it out? I don't know, because English is not my first language. I can tell you in Hebrew how to write it out.
I'm not even sure where, you think it'd probably be on Amazon or something.
Oh, absolutely.
Like that.
It's out there.
Yeah.
And just check it out. You guys can Google however it sounds to you. And here's what was neat in the film, is one of the guys that is depicted, that you probably said hi to, is the secular like low life, these people who were criminal, and they, wearing the tracksuits and that kind of thing. And so here this pastor in Roswell says to me, says to the audience, "Oh, by the way, anybody ever seen that film Oshpizin? Well, Doron was one of those guys." He told me, who would wear those tracksuits. It's true. Those are the people I grew up with. And that guy who depicts the main character in the film, he's actually a Moroccan in real life. I believe he's in real life Moroccan. And those literally are the people I grew up with. And so how do I go from growing up, and if anybody's ever heard of Nicky Cruz,
Sure,
crossing the switchblade, that's kind of how I grew up a little bit. Not as like, how to say, glorified gangster, what have you. Nothing like that. In Israel, the the so-called criminal street life is much different. It's more communal. It's more, this is our part of town versus these guys as part of town. And, where you end up with violence is when, people cross over. And again, it's not like the gangs in America where we walk around with switchblades and, chains.
Because I was just about to say, it sounds a lot like Los Angeles.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's more basic. It's more basic and just, we'll beat you up, the old-fashioned style, and, maybe they'll go get a hold of whatever's around, So that's the kind of folks I grew up with. That's kind of the reality I grew up with. And you might say, well, how's that, why would that be? Did you grow up like in the projects or a bad part of town? No. The funny thing is my family lived in the good side of town, in the nice neighborhoods where we call them villas, where many people in the States live in. These homes are by themselves, and we call those villas. I don't know what you guys call them here, but like residential neighborhoods or what have you, the outskirts of town. Whereas
we call those residential neighborhoods.
Is that it? Okay, see, and so that's kind of the type of neighborhood we grew up in. It's not again like how it is here in the U.S. We're more close together, but again, it was different reality, and so
almost like condos.
Maybe
townhouses. I mean, very, very close together is what you're saying.
Oh, no, not where I grew up. We each had our own home, but it's just. Everything in Israel is smaller because, again, your audience probably from Texas or anywhere in this part of the world, their minds gravitate to much larger proportions. Everything's much smaller in Israel. We don't have so much land. So what we call is half a dunam. Everybody gets half a dunam, and that's the typical. So long story short, I grew up in that kind of neighborhood, but all my friends were in the other part of the neighborhood, and because I had trouble in my family, where my father ended up becoming an alcoholic, my mother was mentally disabled, so we ended up basically growing up on the streets and hanging out with the kids that we were going to school with. That was our reality, and many times we were fed by the mother of one of my friends and that kind of thing. So that was the background. That's where I grew up, in that kind of reality and under terror of threat. Unlike most Israelis, I didn't grow up in the big cities, far away from the borders, far away from the Palestinian-controlled areas where you have lots of violence, lots of terrorist attacks are carried out because of the close proximity to the Jewish communities. So we were literally right up on the border with the Hezbollah, which is, they call themselves God's army is what it means. Yeah, and those guys fired rockets at us ever since I can remember. We lived through the Gulf War. I mean, you know what I'm saying? This is one of the hottest areas. And, new friends that got killed, their parents, the father, and they grew up, fatherless and just crazy stuff like that. And so when I grew up, my whole thing was, these were I guess you could say the benchmarks of our society where I grew up, is a lot of us were pro-Zion, super Zionists. We didn't grow up in like I said, the big cities where you're in what we call in Israel the bubble. Tel Aviv, we call that the bubble, because like I said, they're far away from those realities. And it's a beach town too. You have the beaches, everybody goes, and not everybody, but a lot of folks, they go hit the beach, and it's a different reality, it's a different atmosphere. And so I grew up pro-Zionist and also very committed to end up in a special forces unit so I could go get after those people who were coming after my people. That was my mindset, that was my mentality. And God really did a turn of events in my life and took me from that. We ended up in a foster care, actually in one of the third largest cities in Israel, in Haifa. And for me, that was like, oh my goodness, I'm seeing the world, Wow, and because it was a huge change for me, And like I said, it's a matter of perspective, because where you guys come from, Haifa's just, it's Haifa. And so we went from that to then afterwards running into people like, literally I met Nikki Cruz years later.
Really?
Yeah. Because the family I was with, they were sent out from the church in Haifa, from New York City to Haifa to start a drug and alcohol rehab. And so they were the ones that took my brother and I in and basically took care of us and everything. And so a few years later, we ended up meeting, this Nikki Cruz. And I remember I really liked him because when I met him, personally, it wasn't like with all these people. We had a private meeting with him because he knew the foster parents and Pastor David Wilkerson.
That's who I was trying to think of.
Wilkerson. That's right. So they were good friends and all that, and so we met them. Like I said, not in the big crowd with all these people, and just had this little small encounter as young teenagers. And I remember hearing his life story and seeing how he came out of what he came out of, and I could relate to that. And I thought, man, what a cool guy. And so that was, like I said, that's kind of what we came out of, my brother and I. And through God's hand, he led me from one thing to another, to where years later I ended up, after my military service and after serving the Israeli government as one of the security, working as we were in charge for the facilities of the government buildings in Jerusalem. And specifically, I was in charge of the Ministry of Education, which is the second largest body in Jerusalem. They just have massive amounts of people that work there. And I mean, again, in our perspective in Israel,
comparatively, but that's okay.
Yeah,
that's what
and just all sprout through Jerusalem. And so I went from, your basic whatever guy and ended up being the guy who was in charge of the shift at one point. And so going from that to then later working with Cry for Zion. And the way I got into that was just, again, it's in such a short amount of time to give you the process that I would say God took me through. In a nutshell, here's what happened. When I was working, first in the military actually, I'll back up. When I was in the military, we were serving in the Gaza Strip, and I was watching how the media was portraying what was happening in Gaza and vilifying us. And I thought to myself, these guys are crazy. And for one, I didn't see the media. I'll tell you that. We never saw the media where we operated. Never.
Which means it's hearsay.
Let me correct myself. I did run into the media once, and that was when we had a huge military operation. And this was after one of my best friends was actually blown to bits. And it was a huge military operation to basically put a lockdown on the terrorist activity that was really erupting in the Gaza Strip. And this was in 2004, and you ended up with all these units and everything, and the people were donating pizzas and clothing, and it just was one of those wars that we had. It was a mini war. I wouldn't put it on the level of war, but it was one of those mini, like in 2014, where we just went in there and we're cleaning stuff up, so to speak.
Right.
Then we saw the media, but you know where? Where our barracks were. Where our barracks at the outskirts, where we would rest in between operations and then go in and go operate. None of those guys ever went in with us. We never saw them. So in reality, here's what I discovered. The media, even our own Israeli media, were portraying the reality on the ground based on, like you said, hearsay, whatever, what I thought I heard. And it just shocked me. I thought, what is this? This is wrong. Why do they do this? And of course, I just assumed, well, probably because they want to sell papers or whatever. I didn't really connect it to anti-Semitism and all that at the time. That just was something that I wasn't aware of, actually, until later. Then years later, when I was working with the Israeli government, then I started to see the anti-Semitism in the world. I started to see how governments were treating us. Then I started to see how these different international pressures were coming in and influencing our government. Because I would ask myself, how would these people who have given their life for the country, either militarily or diplomatically in the government, what have you, and just throw their government under the bus, their people.
Right.
And then I discovered it's because of this pressure coming from around the world, and them not having, our leaders not having a biblical foundation to stand on. That's what I discovered. And so just having a passion for the truth and wanting to, I would say, defend Zion, having that passion growing up, like I said, from Kiryat Shmona. One of my heroes, for example, this is just to give you a connection of what I mean about Zionists. The founder of Kiryat Shmona, the founding fathers of the town, if you will, because it was renamed a few times, but the final name stuck, and that was when Joseph Trumpeldor, who is this young officer from the Russian military who came to Israel to defend these communities who were defenseless. You know, they were all about, developing the land, growing, agriculture, building, and all this, draining the swamps, and you name it, but they had no clue about how to defend themselves from the Arab raiders. Because see, back then, there wasn't this whole political spin-off of, the Palestinians and the Israelis are at it again. At that time, it was straight up, just thuggery. They were like the pirates. So those who know about the Somalians, it's like that.
Right.
You had something of value that you're bringing to the region. We're coming to take it because we can, And so he was just appalled at that and says, wait a minute, I have all this military background as an officer in the Russian army, and he lost one of his arms in one of the wars. So he was a one-armed warrior, if you will. And he starts training these guys, these farmers who don't know what they're doing. And he says, here's how you defend yourself. Then the Arab raiders, as they would, come and try to raid and ruin the crops or steal what they could. And they discovered there was a resistance, and then they cowered off. Then one of the raids again, they put up the white flag because they realized, okay, we get it. These guys are, they've changed their strategy on us. So they come in to negotiate with our leaders in the compound where we had fortified ourselves. And during that meeting, the Arab leaders that came and sat down with our leaders of the Jewish community there pulled out from under their robes their weapons and started shooting and killing our leaders, and one of them was Joseph Trumpeldor. So 8 people fell that night, and those 8 people are why we named the town Kiryat Shmona. So Joseph Trumpeldor, he's one of my heroes, and this is, like I said, this is what is in the back of my mind. This is what's in my DNA, if you will, as to what guides me as one who is going to fight for Zion. And it was his dying words that stuck with me forever. And it's this. He said, as he was dying, this was what was recorded by the medic that was taking care of him. As he was passing away, he says, you know what? It's good to die for one's land. And he meant it's good to die for this land. Not just any land, but for this land. And when I read that as a young boy, when I grew up under that type of, there's a monument with a lion crying out to heaven to commemorate these 8 people. And I always remembered the Lion of Judah, that roar of, we're going to fight for what is true. We're not going to back down. We're not going to let people bully us. And that was always within my DNA, while at the same time trying to, to harness that and not become violent, not to become hateful, not to become vindictive. And that was something that, like I said, this is something that God did in my life. It was a whole process to where I don't hate my enemies. I don't vilify them, and I just, it's just, they're declaring war on me, and it's a free, it's a clean fight. I'm going to fight you back. And so on the battlefield and in the political world, in the media world, the new media, public diplomacy, and get that message out of truth from the land of Israel. Because what people don't realize is not just a battlefield war that we're fighting, but it's a war of ideas. It's a war of principles.
Absolutely.
Of what's true versus false.
Yes.
And the ones who are king at it, it's the media, it's the Palestinian people, it's the communists. America's falling behind. Israel's falling behind. The West has no voice of what's true and what's good, because the West is accepting the lie that's been given them via your television sets.
Yes.
You sit there watching these movies and TV shows that are pumping you with the idea of the enemy.
Yes.
Why? Because back in the 50s, they looked at America and said, we can't defeat you. And what you did is you cornered the communists into a corner, like a wild animal. If you've ever seen a wild animal, if you corner that sucker, you're doing a very big mistake. You're asking for that animal to take you out, basically. Right. And that's what America did. You cornered these guys, and they're clever. The Russians know what they're doing. They're not stupid people. You underestimate your enemy, he's gonna take you out. And I think that's what happened, is America underestimated what they were going after. And then what the Russians did is they did the most genius thing you could do. It's evil, but it's genius. They said, America's too moral, we can't defeat them because they're a godly country. So we have to demoralize them. You know the story with Balak and Bilam, and where the king asked this prophet of God who hears from God to go and curse Israel, and he can't do it. But then he says, well, wait a minute. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some advice, because he wanted money, because he was losing, because he realized, like, every time he opened his mouth, he was giving these big declarations of blessing and all.
Of course.
And then finally he goes, I know how you're going to defeat them. I'll give you advice. I can't speak evil, but I'll give you advice. What does he tell him? Make them immoral. Make them sleep with your daughters. Have your daughters go into the camp of Israel, entice and demoralize them so that you'll be able to defeat them. So this is what the Russians did. They took literally the advice of this prophet and this wicked prophet, and took that advice, and they just used that towards you. And they used your television sets, they used your magazines, billboards, you name it. And that's why today, America, when you go and step foot outside or anywhere in the West, that used to be Christian nations that had the Judeo-Christian values from Israel. It's from our Torah, your legal systems, your justice system in anywhere in the West, most places in the world. I don't know about the East, to be honest. I don't know how they have developed ones that were not colonized, but I imagine their laws are not based off the biblical Torah laws, whereas your nations in the West, who stemmed out of a Christian Judeo faith, that's where you get your moral compass,
sure,
your justice.
Right.
And now when you step outside, you look at the world that you're in today, it's nothing resembling that whatsoever. And you have these legal judges and whatever that are making unrighteous judgments. Why? You have the foundation, you have all the truth, on your side. What's the problem? You've been demoralized.
Sure.
You've been twisted to
Right.
believe a certain way to where there's no moral compass anymore.
I would say even up to the point of this past administration in the White House that
yeah.
we've heard so many times, we've been brainwashed into hearing that you're stopping the two-state solution. Now, what I love about that is,
Right.
in my mind, that is not a solution.
No.
It cannot happen. You can't have what they're saying is going to bring peace. That will
Correct.
not bring peace. That will bring nothing but anarchy and war.
Correct. Absolutely. In fact, what they're asking for is a four-state solution. Let me be clear. I'll repeat that. What they're asking for is a four-state solution.
So explain.
Absolutely. The Gaza Strip was already given away to the Palestinians. They have their own state there. Israel's not preventing them from statehood. Israel's not. They said, you can have it, we're out. So Gaza Strip, given away. What they're asking for is giving away Judea and Samaria, right? And that is the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. It's, if you're a Christian or a Jew or anybody who cares about what is righteous and correct in this world, then that would be the most unjust thing, to take away the only connection to the Jewish people from our land and say, well, just take this away. If you take that away, we have no right in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in the Negev, or anywhere else, because this is the only title deed that we have to our land. So that's number two. They want to give that away, and that's what they're calling the two-state. Then you have Jordan. Jordan was the first state and piece of land that Israel got cut away from it, which was supposed to be part of the Jewish homeland under the British mandate in 1920, according to the San Remo League of Nations. And people keep talking about this international law like it's like the supreme law on this earth. And where I come from is the Word of God is the supreme law on this planet. And the Jewish people, we are going to remain true to the Word of God, regardless of my secular friends, regardless of, what have you. This is what's right. So we're not budging on that.
And it's not like the Jewish people have all this land.
No, no. I mean, we were talking about dimensions, right? So 77% was given away, and that's Jordan. So you have Jordan, you have Judea, Samaria, which they're calling occupied territory / West Bank. You're talking about the Gaza Strip, and then Israel. That's the fourth state, right? That's a four-state solution, and that's madness. That's absolute madness. It's taking what we've already, we've already been robbed of, and saying, take away more. And here's what it boils down to. It boils down to, like I said, through the journey that I learned, and I mean, I was quite naive to most of these things, so I had a hard lesson in history and the way this world operates. And here's the bottom line. There are three things that are fought against throughout history, and it's always going to be until Messiah comes. That is the land of Israel, which is the land of God, the people of Israel, which are the people of God, and the Word of God, which is His Word, which holds all those things together. The enemy of Israel, the usurper, he comes to steal, kill, destroy each and every one of those three things. So notice that the nations of the world who are anti-God, they're against God. They've thrown away the biblical foundations that they came out of and said, we don't want that. So, so they went from the dark ages and now they're going into something much darker and more evil, and they don't even know it. And it's because it's after the Enlightenment movement. So they're so smart, they're so educated. And so therefore what they really are is educated idiots. They're people that have an education, so-called. They're smart, but they're stupid and blind because of the darkness of their hearts that makes them make dumb decisions, honestly. And so the bottom line is that here's what's happening. The nations of the world are coming against always these three things. If you identify that and understand that, then the bottom line is basically the world is anti-Semitic. It's something you can't explain. We try to be secular, we try to be this, we try to be Jewish. No matter what we tried, assimilate, you name it, the nations hate us. What we need to do right now is we need to rise up and we need to make our voices heard, and we need to be strong about fighting for our right to the land. And that's what we're doing with Cry for Zion. That's what we started. It's called Cry for Zion. You can go to cryforzion.com, and there's where you can go look up what we're doing. You go to the support part there. You can support us if you like. And this is how we can make a change in the land of Israel today. The little guy from Upper Galilee can make a change. You can as well from where you come from.
I love it. Love it. I know enough about you. I've been around you long enough off and on as we've done TV together, different shows, to know that you are very much about changing the world. You're about changing the world.
In the right way.
Specifically about bringing morality back and a right perspective on what's right and what's wrong.
Yes.
You are a world changer. And I'm grateful
you could say so.
and honoring
by
to
God's
know
grace.
You. By God's grace. Now, here's the point of this show, is that Doron, myself, everyone that comes onto this show, we're all the same, just like you. That means you too can change the world. You can make a difference in the world around you. You truly can, through the power of God, through standing up for what is right and doing the right thing no matter what the cost. I'm glad you joined us this week, and we are praying that you rise up, do the right thing, and change this world. God bless. We'll see you next week. Shalom, shalom.